This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
There are still questions about how Google's money will be doled out and who's eligible to receive it, including the CBC. This agreement allows Google to work directly with one group that will represent all media outlets. The government says these details will be sorted out and made public by the end of this year.
That was the tail end of a CBC News report late last year, discussing how the government had tried to salvage Bill C-18, the Online News Act, with Google agreeing to pay $100 million a year to support the news industry. While most of the focus that day was on the money, the end of the report highlighted that many of the details, including the mechanisms for distribution, were yet to come. Over the past few months, those details have become increasingly contentious, including disputes over the single collective charged with the distributions, a CRTC consultation on the issue, and ongoing lobbying for support for the sector at the provincial level. Peter Menzies spent 3 decades as a working journalist and newspaper executive, most notably with the Calgary Herald, where he served as its editorial page editor, editor-in-chief, and finally publisher. He then spent another 10 years at the CRTC, including 4 as Vice Chair of Telecommunications. Peter has been one of the most prominent voices on the state of the news sector in Canada, and he joins me on the podcast to discuss recent developments alongside proposed reforms that might do a better job of addressing mounting concerns over the independence of the press. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. You know, there has been, so to speak, a lot of news about the news lately. We were talking just before we got started how it seems something is happening pretty much every week. You know, I want to canvass a bit what's been happening, some of the risks that have emerged, and some of your thoughts on what you think we should be doing. Now, some of this conversation comes from a new report that you've authored called Unbreaking the News, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But, you know, why don't we start there? You know, I guess it raises that title, Unbreaking the News, raises the question, is the news broken in Canada?
Well, some of it is and some of it isn't, which is probably not fair. But my general view is that no, the news isn't broken, but the platforms, the business models of some legacy companies that we depended upon to deliver the news are broken. And the problem is right now that we're getting into is that rather than fixing them or finding new ones, and there are some good examples of people who are trying and who have succeeded, we're falling into what I fear would be a sort of permanent state of subsidy, where we're subsidizing things that aren't working rather than focusing on things that are working and how to help them work even better.
What do you know? So that's sort of the business side of the development. You know, I know there was a recent poll that you sought to highlight that provided some perspective on what the public has to say about some of these issues. What did it say?
Well, it said that the public is increasingly distrustful of media, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that media gets questioned more in the age of the internet. It doesn't have the conversation between consumers and media isn't as one way as it used to be. Back when I worked in it, we decided what the news was of the day. That was part of our job. People trusted us to do that well. But as I remember one of my editors telling me one time, Peter, no one knows what doesn't get in the paper. But now everybody does, right? And so media have to justify themselves all the time. So in a sense, there's not enough trusted news, but in another sense, there's so much information and news out there that people are questioning all the time, and questioning tends to lead to more mistrust. Plus, there have been some big changes in the last few years, particularly since 2016, in how many news organizations have chosen to deliver the news. And I think it's pretty questionable as to whether that is being well received by the public.
Okay, that's interesting. It's certainly an interesting observation about never having more access than we have now, which in some ways sparks some of the kinds of questioning that we're seeing. You know, let's talk a bit about some of the responses that we've seen, especially from government in response to sector concerns, at least around the economics. Um, Bill C-18's been a popular topic on my podcast for a long time. certainly listeners will be familiar with the fact that we are now basically about a year of blocked news links on the Meta platforms, Facebook and Instagram. There was the Google deal seeking to salvage things about a little over 6 months ago now. Where are we at? Because I know we're at the CRTC. There is a consultation that's just been launched. Can you bring people up to speed on how the implementation side of Bill C-18 is going?
Yeah, where we're at right now is that, Google eventually managed to get the government to agree to a deal. The government articulates it differently, and recipients of the deal are definitely articulating it differently, as a success for the government. But Bill C-18 was a defeat for the government, and it managed to salvage total destruction, avoid total destruction through its deal with Google. So Google's chosen its preferred administration team or administrator collective for the fund. It's ready to write the check. It's made its application to the CRTC for its exemption from the act, and now the CRTC is holding a public process, um, to basically, I guess, confirm that. There's quite a bit of squabbling going on over Google's choice of collective. It had a choice between two. One represented, well over 90% of the industry and all the big players, and the one Google chose, um, was a much smaller one, probably a dozen or so independence and that sort of stuff. So there's quite a bit of concern been raised by the larger collective about that, although it frankly it just comes across as sour grapes for the most part because in the end everybody gets their a seat at the table, and I think in the end it doesn't really matter except those guys probably the guys who didn't get it were the ones who had been accusing Google of stealing their content for like 3 or 4 years. So it's kind of not surprising that they chose someone else when you think about it. But that's where we're stuck right now. If hopefully the CRTC doesn't drag it out for everybody's sake, because the people who want the money need the money, and it's probably seeing as the government is unwilling to admit its error around C-18. We might as well move on and try to make the most of it.
Okay. Well, speaking of moving on, government's got its C-18, and as you mentioned, it's at the CRTC through this approval process of the collective, and then ultimately the distribution of the Google funds. But governments aren't stopping there, and we've seen a number of new developments, both federally, but most notably, I think even provincially now. Can you talk about what else has now been added to the mix?
Well, the government a few years ago, was lobbied to have a journalism labor tax credit, which it introduced, and then it introduced a local journalism initiative, which was sort of $10 million a year. But everything, and all of them were supposed to be for a 5-year temporary period, while the industry transitioned to the digital age. Um, but they're all looking pretty permanent now. They've all been doubled in size, in regards to that. Who knows? There might be more. And News Media Canada is the sort of lobbying arm for that legacy industry. Having found success, basically the government has done just about exactly what it has asked it to do every time. They're kind of on a roll, and they've moved on to provincial governments. First of all, they've had quite a bit of success in Quebec over the years. It doesn't get quite as much attention in the English press as it might. So pretty much well over 50% of every journalist's salary in Quebec is now paid for through a combination of federal and provincial subsidy. Canada is close to that. Doug Ford decided to take 25% of Ontario's advertising budget and spend it on legacy Ontario media or approved Ontario media, um, which is just that's just a subsidy in disguise, right? I mean, if you people spend money on advertising because they get a response, and they spend that money, and in order to get that response, they spend it where they're going to get the response, which is why they spend a lot of it on social media and new age platforms rather than the old ones. So, yeah, so Ontario is now doing it, and they've got strings attached to it, right? They've got certain content expectations in terms of it being, reflecting local information and culture, which is pretty subjective, but they've also kept a pretty short leash on it. They're going to review it quarterly.
Right. Okay. I mean, that's actually a perfect segue into the question of some of the risks that these initiatives have to the independence of the press. If you're talking about strings attached to new money, that really does speak to questions about the independence of the news media in Canada when government gets as engaged and involved financially in particular as it has been. What do you see as some of the risks that can arise as part of the framework that has unfolded around, as you say, tax credits and now direct support through advertising and some of the other initiatives that have taken place in Canada?
Well, I think, throughout the whole process of C18 and some of the other stuff, I think the risks have revealed themselves through the process, right? And newspapers, some of the newspapers that have been the most, uh, the strongest proponents of the act have stifled uh, debate on their pages, right? Now, they're free to do it. That's what a free press means. You can print what you want and not print what you choose to. But nevertheless, it sets a kind of odd example because it has shown that media and some of the recent reporting, which I'll sort of get to, it has shown that media are willing to adjust their normal journalism practices and standards um, in terms of government legislation when that legislation works in their shareholders' interests. So, for instance, last week in the reporting on Doug Ford's subsidy or advertising switch, how you see it, there was no comment there in either the Star or Post Media stories. There were no contrary views. There was no even effort to say the Star has reached out to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation for comment and didn't receive any or anything like that. It's just all, here's our publisher says it's great, and here's the other guy saying our publisher says it great, exactly, and then quotes from the government. And I mean, in the case of the Post, they had the story on the front page. They turned it to their second page, where you had one column talking about how wise Doug Ford was for doing what they'd asked him to do, and then another one doing just the same, which was written Paul Deegan, who's the lobbyist who had asked him Ford to do that, and then Brian Lilly's column says now Justin Trudeau should do the same thing. He should be just as wise as Doug Ford. I mean, you're free to do that. Like I said, a free press means you can be whatever you want, but I think they've set the example of what the risks are. And the risks are is that you see a certain um, sometimes subtle, sometimes in the examples I just gave, less subtle toadyism when it comes to government policy. And I think it's sad because, as we were saying earlier, in the age of the internet, you can't get away with that stuff. Like somebody's going to notice, right? And it just ends up further diminishing people's trust in you. So you end up being an increasingly well-funded and less effective media.
Yeah, no, that's an interest that sure seems like the trade-off. And you're right. The example that you provided certainly was particularly striking. You just looked at this page and it was just this full court press in favor of the
I don't
policy
even
and then
understand.
extending the policy.
I don't even understand how they thought people wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
You know, anyway. But there you go. I mean, like I said, they're free to do it, freedom of the press and all that. But once you start showing that you're going to adjust your principles based on your self-interest, people will trust you less.
Okay. Now, speaking of trust and some of the kinds of solutions that people are thinking about, I wanted to shift. You participated in an event on the news now back in the spring. It's a number of months ago, and it led to what's been called now the Ottawa Declaration. Can we start first with the event? Can you describe it and some of the perspectives that were brought to bear? Because I know there was an effort to bring a pretty wide range of stakeholders and perspectives on the state of news in Canada.
Yeah, what we tried to do was we wanted to have a meaningful discussion about the future of news, not the past, right? Because I mean, we need to know where we're going, and where we're going. The assumption behind it is that just subsidizing the past, is like you know the old buggy whip analogy, that sort of stuff. We need to find a path forward. So there were a lot of a lot of innovators, but people I can't name names because it was Chatham House rules and that sort of stuff. But the range of opinions that that came out were really interesting. I mean, there was some established media, there was some almost brand new media, there were some people who'd been poking away at it in the digital age for many years. I mean, going back, far long before people thought that digital would be necessarily the main platform of delivery. But what you saw were some people saying, I don't know what the big deal is about subsidies. We'll have our firewall. We conduct ourselves appropriately. We, look at the CBC's done it for years and they fight for their independence and there's little, evidence that they don't do it. So you have that at the one end. And then at the other end, you have folks who sort of say, no, I will die on this hill of media independence. I'm not taking a nickel and government money from anybody. I do this for my readers, my listeners, my viewers, and that's a hill I'm going to die on. That is sort of the view that my generation of journalists grew up with. I'm old enough to remember going back to the Kent Commission and it making all kinds of recommendations and the publishers basically thumbing their noses at the government and saying no. We are not going to do anything the government tells us to do, particularly because the government just told us to do it, right? Um, and they had their faults for sure, but it was this battle for independence. And then there were people in between, like I don't want to take a subsidy, but I don't see how I'm going to survive without a subsidy. And I really don't want to get a subsidy, but if everybody else is getting it, how can I survive? Right? How can I get there then? And sort of like, in a couple of years, like right now, I'm not taking it, but in a couple of years, I might have to. So there was, I don't think, I mean, 80% of the room, I would say, was very uncomfortable with the idea of subsidies, but probably 60 to 70% of those 80% had a sense of sort of fatalism about it that they were probably going to have to just to stay in the game.
It's interesting. Now, there were clearly some that decided they will not take those subsidies, and that's what led to this Ottawa Declaration. Can you talk about what that is? And that there, I think you can name names, or at least some, and talk a
Yeah,
bit about who signed it.
yeah, for sure. I mean, Rudyard Griffiths and Sean Spear at the Hub were really the guys behind that declaration, and it initially got thrown out as because we sort of said before, look, not a lot of people will be able to sign something like that without consulting with their co-owners, their board, and that sort of stuff right off the gate. So sort of threw it out for debate, and sort of as you would have expected from my previous comments, some people said, no way, I'm not signing that. Some people looked at it and sort of said, well, wait a second, I can't survive without subsidy. I serve a minority audience that's been, heritage has done, so I get that. But, the signatories were people like Andrew Coyne, who's been, a very useful voice in this, and probably had some interesting internal discussions at the Globe from time to time on it. But he's been very prominent and a powerful voice in arguing for media independence from government funding. Paul Wells would be an example. Holly Doan and Tom Korski at Blacklock's, Western Standard. You know, uh, those are the ones that come to mind immediately in terms of signing it. But typically, um, innovators, a blend. I guess I'd say a blend between modern age digital innovators and old school um, thinkers like Andrew and Paul and that, or people not old school thinkers. I don't want to say it that way, but people who come from that sort of old school cultural perspective on media independence. So all in all, it's only a dozen or so people, but it may grow after people consult with other areas. But it was uh, it was a good first step.
Yeah, it was certainly interesting to see some willing to take that public position. Now,
Well, particularly because so much of the narrative's been dominated by people willing to take it.
yeah, no, I think that's right. And, it does highlight that there is some opposition, even within the industry, to the emergence of the news regulatory and support kind of network that we've seen now established. Now, perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of what you most recently wrote involved identifying a bunch of fixes, because very often, the response is, well, okay, you don't like this and you don't like that. What do you like? What would be some of the solutions? And you've tried to identify a bunch. So maybe you can walk through if you were given the lead on policy and trying to solve some of these issues, what are some of the kinds of solutions you've identified?
Yeah, I mean, this ball got rolling a little bit with a paper that Conrad von Finkenstein and I did last year. So some of these ideas are from that paper, and some of them have developed a little bit more. But the fundamental sort of the first thing that has to be done, as far as I'm concerned with this, is you got to address the issue of the CBC. And nobody seems to want to be able to take that seriously. And it's quite frustrating because it's like, how hard can this be? You cannot have the largest single player in the industry getting a government subsidy of $1.4 billion and expect anything to work, right? In my view, it just distorts the entire playing field as you would. And that doesn't mean necessarily that, you go on a defund the CBC, kill the CBC rant. But the CBC, if it's going to exist, needs to exist, in my view, as a pure public broadcaster, not competing for commercial advertising dollars and commercial audiences to help attract those advertising dollars in the way that the CBC does, prioritizing GTA and Greater Montreal listenership, and for instance. So you need to get CBC decommercialized for starters, and then there's a bunch of other stuff that can flow through from there, like Creative Commons license for CBC content, so that subsidized content that is subsidized by public money is available to everybody. That would be particularly helpful to small players. And then other things like, if you're going to have subsidies, subsidize the consumer of the product through enhanced tax deductibility of news subscriptions. For instance, right now you're subsidizing the producer. The producer doesn't really have to care as much anymore about where. To me, it has sort of CRTC flashbacks, because what you're subsidizing is production, not consumption. So if you want to have an effective system, you subsidize the news consumer to if those are the behaviors that you think are a public good, and that sort of stuff. And then, it goes from there.
Okay. Interesting. I like the optimism in terms of that there are some solutions. There are things we could be thinking about. I'm not saying you're optimistic it's going to happen, but you at least are turning sort of the debate from here. Not only here are some of the problems with what's been proposed, but here are some proposed solutions as well. But I have to say, and maybe we can wrap with this, over the past year, obviously, as mentioned, we've seen the full news link ban on Meta properties, the desperation deal with Google, this battle now that you talked about over the collective, and even more government support that, as you highlighted, erase some of the independence concerns or exacerbates some of them which already existed. I guess my question for you is, where do you see things a year from now? Are we just going to continue to move along this path with ever more demands for government support, along with the unveiling or the distribution of some of the money out of C18? Or is there any hope that we might see a course correction in terms of some of these policies?
Well, there's always hope, but as they say in soccer, it's the hope that kills you, right? Like, that's where I kind of go back and forth almost on a daily basis. Whereas, like you said, you enjoyed the optimism. Part of the optimism stems from pessimism, though, because sometimes when you're throwing out these ideas, you think, oh, somebody must have looked into them and found out they wouldn't work. Fact is, nobody's really looked into them. They just the industry largely just moved to the path of least resistance, and the path of innovation is hard. The path of least resistance was going and knocking on the door of the PMO and saying, "We want money, give us some." Those guys over there have money. Why don't you get some of theirs and give it to us? And that's sadly, I think, where we're going to be a year from now. I just think that News Media Canada has, I mean, hats off to their lobbyists. They've done the job. They're bringing home the bacon. And the industry is just kind of like, wow, if we'd known it was this easy, we would have done this 10 years ago. That's the problem with governments that are so susceptible to lobbyists. And that's a sad thing about this government. it's one thing to let lobbyists, express their opinion, and you got to consult with industry and know what things look like. But man, when you just salute and say, okay, and do it, we've seen this with C11, we've seen it with C18, and you're getting certain groups the money they want, but I don't think you're creating very good public policy at a very sustainable industrial framework. And I'm deeply concerned that the Canadian news industry, for which I still have a great deal of affection, is just putting itself into this pit, and I don't know how it'll get out of it.
Yeah. Well, Peter, there are not that many people that can speak authoritatively about a sector based on their own experience, having worked in the industry for so many years and now have spent many years calling attention to the implications of some of the policies. And you've been really one of the most important voices in that regard. So thank you for that voice, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, thanks very much for having me. It's flattering and always a pleasure.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.